G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of Israel, Past, Present and Future. I pray that this will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to session 18, Israel, Past, Present and Future. We're into that section where we're looking at the other relevant topics, and these are the symbolic illustrations of Israel. Last session we saw Israel as the son of God, a kingdom of priests, and what was the second one? Forgotten. But they're two of them anyway. Anyway, we're up to number 4, which is the vineyard of Jehovah. The vine, more than the fig tree, is the common symbol of Israel. It's the vine. Isaiah used this motif more than many others. It's first found in Isaiah chapter 3, verses 14 to 15, where he accused the leadership of Israel of spoiling God's vineyard, which was Israel. And this, how did they do that? Well, they did it by oppressing the people. And then Isaiah then went on to elaborate on this theme in chapter 5, verses 1 to 7. And it begins with a song commonly called the Song of the Vineyard in verses 1 and 2 of Isaiah 5. And this song pictures the vineyard as planted on excellent soil and arranged in such a way that it receives sunlight all day long. So the farmer did all that he could to make it produce. It had everything going for it, this vine. Plowed the soil, removed the stones, planted the choicest vines available, and built a watchtower right in the middle of it to keep a careful eye on it. And before the harvest, he cut out a wine press, expecting to need it. However, instead of producing edible grapes, what it did was this vineyard produced sour grapes. And this is the way the song in Isaiah 5, verses 1 to 2 ends. And this leads then to the judgment of the vineyard in verses 3 to 6 of Isaiah 5. Isaiah calls upon the nation of Israel to pass judgment between the vineyard and the keeper of the vineyard in verse 3. But the keeper raises a rhetorical question. He said, could anything more be done than what was done in order to get the vineyard to produce good grapes? He said, I did everything. There was nothing more to be done. The question demands a negative answer. No, nothing more could have possibly been done. Therefore, the vineyard is guilty, not the keeper of the vineyard. And in judgment, the keeper will break down and remove the protective wall so that it will be trampled upon by man and animal in verse 5 of Isaiah 5. And also, the vineyard will no longer be pruned, but will suffer drought until it becomes a desolate waste, according to verse 6. And then the passage concludes in verse 7 with the application. The nation of Israel is that vineyard. The good grapes that Israel was to have produced were justice and righteousness. And instead, what did they get? The people produced wild grapes of oppression. And now Israel will suffer destruction. And later on in Isaiah 27, verses 2 to 6, the prophet has a brighter future for this vineyard. And this too is another song in verse 2. In the future, God will replant the devastated vineyard and will water it and watch it day and night, according to verse 3 of Isaiah 27. And then he will declare war on the thorns and the briars that may try to destroy the vineyard unless they make peace with him, in verses 4 and 5. And as a result of the replanting and God's watchful care, the vineyard will blossom and bud and produce fruit for the entire world. That's verse 6. So what he's saying is that in the future kingdom, Israel will bring justice and righteousness among the nations, because that's the fruit it produces. And Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 21 pictures Israel as a noble vine and as a right seed that had turned into the degenerate branches of a foreign vine. And in this way, Jeremiah pictures Israel slipping into idolatry. Also, just like Isaiah, Jeremiah accuses the leadership of Israel of desolating the vineyard in verses 10 to 11 of chapter 12. It's the many shepherds, it's many leaders, the many shepherds who have destroyed God's vineyard and turned it into a desolate wilderness. And then another prophet, Hosea, picks it up in Hosea 10, verses 1 to 3. He picks up this vine theme, and he's picturing Israel as an extremely fruitful, luxuriant vine, but only in mass producing what? Idolatry. Like Jeremiah, Hosea uses the vineyard motif to accuse Israel of gross idolatry. And the vine motif comes again in the context of Israel's national pleading for the Messiah in Psalm 80, verses 8 to 16. Back at the Exodus, you see in verse 8 of Psalm 80, God brought a vine out of Egypt and planted it in the land of Israel. And that's verses 9 and 10. But its influence, the vine's influence, extended far beyond the borders of the land in verse 11. But now the vine has suffered destruction in verses 12 and 13. Why? Because God had removed the protective wall in verse 12. And as the nations have now trampled it in verse 13, Israel now pleads for deliverance from God in verse 14 of Psalm 80. Why? Because the vineyard that God planted in verse 15 has now been destroyed by fire in verse 16. Now, Yeshua, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, also illustrated Israel as a vineyard misused by her leaders in Matthew 21, verses 33 to 46. And the parallel passages in the Gospels are in Mark 11, verses 1 to 2, and Luke 20, verse 9 to 19. The point of the parable here in the Gospels is that Israel's leaders have killed the prophets, and now they will kill the Son. And we see this as we go on with this explanation. The householder is God the Father. The vineyard is Israel, as in the Old Testament. The husbandmen or keepers are the Jewish leaders. The servants are the prophets, and the Son, well, he's the Messiah. As in Isaiah's Song of the Vineyard, God planted a vineyard, built a protective hedge and a watchtower, and he dug a winepress expecting to use it. He leased the land to the keepers, which were the Jewish leaders, and he was expecting to receive fruit. But when it failed to come, he sent 3 sets of servants. We had the pre-exilic prophets, pre-exile prophets, the post-exile prophets, and then John the Baptist and his disciples. However, all the prophets were rejected. Every one of the prophets was rejected. What did he then do? Well, then he sent his Son. But the Jewish leaders then conspired against the Son, and they killed him. So God's response was to send a judgment of death against the leaders, which came in the year AD 70. The application is made in Matthew 21, verses 43 and 44, where Jesus said, "The kingdom of God shall be taken away from you and shall be given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof. And he that falls on this stone shall be broken to pieces, but on whomsoever it shall fall, it will scatter him as dust." Now, when Jesus said this, the leadership of Israel recognized that the parable applied to them, as can be seen in Matthew 21, verse 45. And when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he spoke of them. The point here is that the offer of the Messianic kingdom was rescinded from that generation of Israel, especially the leaders of that day. And it's going to be offered to another Jewish generation with a different body of leadership. And that future generation will accept it. And then the vineyard will become what it was prophesied to become, what we saw back in Isaiah 27, verses 2 to 6. Now we go on to another illustration, which is the clay and the potter. And this illustration here, this relationship emphasizes that God, as the potter, has absolute authority over Israel, the clay, either to shape it or if need be, to destroy it. Therefore, according to Isaiah, it is foolish for Israel to deny that God made Israel, or that the maker of Israel lacks understanding, which is exactly what they did in Isaiah 29, verse 16. It's also foolish for Israel to object to God's plan for Israel, for it is like clay striving against its maker in Isaiah 45, verse 9. Though Israel, the clay, did object in the past, in the future it will submit, recognizing that God knows best, according to Isaiah 64, verse 8. Now, Jeremiah, he also used this motif more extensively. And one example in Jeremiah is Jeremiah chapter 18, verses 1 to 12. The passage here begins with a symbolic action in verses 1 to 4. God commanded the prophet to go to the house of the potter and to observe how he worked. How does he make a pot? Verses 1 to 3. And then Jeremiah noted that as the potter was forming the clay, it became marred in the process. And since the clay was still soft, well, the potter then simply remodeled it to make another thing as seemed good to the potter to make. Verse 4. Then comes the interpretation in verses 5 and 6 of Jeremiah 18. The potter represents God, and the clay represents Israel. And just as the potter has full control over the clay, so God has full control over Israel. And the application is that God is able to fully carry out his threats against Israel in verses 7 to 12. This theme is then picked up again later on in Jeremiah 19, verses 1 to 15. And it begins with another symbolic action in verses 1 to 10. This time the prophet is commanded to make a potter's earthen vessel in verse 1. And then with the elders of the people and the priest, again in verse 1, he's to go down to the valley of Hinnom in verse 2. And there, before the leadership of Israel, Jeremiah is to denounce the idolatry and human sacrifice and announce the coming judgment for it in verses 3 to 9. And he's then to conclude his denunciation by breaking the earthen vessel in verse 10. And this is then followed by the application in verses 11 to 15. Just as Jeremiah broke the earthen vessel and it shattered and scattered, so will God break Israel and Jerusalem until they are shattered and scattered. Yeah, Paul, the Apostle Paul, his discussion of the potter and clay in Romans 9, verses 19 to 24, is in the context here of Israel's national election and in keeping with the Old Testament motif of the clay and the potter. And we saw that back when we did Israel present. We covered that pretty extensively back then. Now we come to the servant of Jehovah, another illustration of Israel. Isaiah uses the term servant in three different ways. In Isaiah 42, 1 to 4 and 49, 1 to 13 and 52, 13 to 53, 12, he uses it of the Messiah, the servant of Jehovah. The other two ways relate to Israel. At times, Isaiah calls Israel, the whole nation, a servant. And then at other times, he uses the term only of the remnant. We saw some of this under Israel future when we looked at it, when we spoke about the remnant. When dealing with the remnant and the tribulation, we saw Isaiah 41 verses 8 to 20 and Isaiah 65 verse 8 to 16. And then of national Israel with 42, 18 to 22 and 43, 8 to 13, 44, 1 to 5 and 21 to 23, along with 45 verse 4 and 48 verse 20. So that's the way Isaiah uses the term servant in his book. Now, as far as the nation is concerned, one example of this usage is seen in Isaiah 42 verse 18 to 43 verse 13, which speaks of the coming deliverance from Babylon. The passage begins by declaring Israel's spiritual blindness in verses 18 to 22. Although Israel is a servant of Jehovah, she's a blind servant in verses 18 to 20. So Israel has now become a plundered people in verses 21 and 22 of Isaiah 42. However, greater judgment is yet to come according to verses 23 and 25, or 225. For God will turn his servant over to the robbers because of all their sins. And then the passage then makes a promise of redemption in Isaiah 43, verses 1 to 4. God is Israel's creator, and so fully intends to redeem her in 43:1. No matter what water or fire the nation will experience, it's going to survive in verse 2. God is Israel's savior in verse 3, and Israel is precious and honorable in the sight of God in verse 4. Isaiah then describes the final regathering in verse 5 to 7, stating that it will be from the four corners of the earth. This is Isaiah 43. With all of this now accomplished, Israel will now be called upon to witness on God's behalf in verses 8 to 13 of Isaiah 43. Israel is caused to testify in verse 8, and in spite of her blindness, and the Gentiles are now called upon to listen in verse 9. And at that time, Israel, the chosen servant, will now understand who God is. Verse 10, and she will testify to that truth before the Gentiles in verses 11 to 13. The servant motif is then picked up again in Isaiah 44, verses 1 to 5. Israel is again declared to be a chosen servant, verse 1, a servant formed by God in verse 2. And for that reason, the servant nation is destined for an outpouring of the Holy Spirit in verse 3. And that will then lead to Israel's national salvation in verses 4 to 5. This is Isaiah 44. It is because Israel is the servant of Jehovah that she is promised a national salvation in Isaiah 44, verses 21 to 23. Israel's status is still that of a servant, although she does not know the Lord at this time. Isaiah 45:4 tells us that. And for that same reason, Israel will be redeemed from Babylon in Isaiah 48, verse 20. Another illustration of Israel is the flock of God. Now, like the church, Israel has a shepherd and sheep relationship with God. The singular shepherd is God. The plurality of shepherds are the Jewish leaders, and the sheep or flock is Israel. And we can find this in Psalm 28, verse 9, Psalm 78, verse 52, and Psalm 80, verse 1. One example of this relationship is Jeremiah 23, verses 1 to 4. Here, God accuses the Jewish leaders or the shepherds of causing the scattering of Israel. It says they scatter the sheep of my pasture. And he lays the blame squarely on the leadership, the shepherds, the Jewish leadership. And God announces his judgment in verse 2. What they have done to the flock, he's now going to do to them. Meanwhile, God intends to regather the remnant of his flock and return them to the land in verse 3 of Jeremiah 23. And at that time, God will give to Israel righteous shepherds who will feed the flock with knowledge and understanding and never be guilty of leading the people astray. That's verse 4. And the same point was made earlier on in Jeremiah 3, verse 15. In that day, God himself will be Israel's chief shepherd to care for them, even if they are ruled by human shepherds. And we find that in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 11, and Jeremiah 31, verse 10. Now, an extensive treatment of this motif is found in Ezekiel 34, 1 to 31. We're not going to look at this, it's a very long passage. It's simply a prophecy against the shepherds of Israel who are guilty of leading the flock astray and failing to feed it, but freely feeding off the flock themselves. And finally, they scatter the flock in verses 1 to 5. God will now judge the shepherds, and they will be removed from leadership in verses 6 to 10. Now, as for the sheep, God will gather them from everywhere to bring them back to the land. And there they will be fed, watered, and healed in verses 11 to 16 of Ezekiel 34. And in preparation for this final gathering of the flock, God will judge the individual sheep, and a segment of the flock will be destroyed because of their sins. Verses 17 to 22 tell us that. The remnant that is finally restored will have one human shepherd over them, and that is the resurrected King David. We find it in verses 23 to 24. Also, Ezekiel 37, verse 24. Ezekiel 37, verse 24. Now, at that time, the flock will enter into the new covenant and will be able to fully enjoy the fruits of the land. And that's verses 25 to 29. For Israel is now the flock of God in verses 30 to 31. Now, in Zechariah 11, verse 4 to 14, the motif here is viewed in a messianic light as Zechariah plays the part of the good shepherd. And the account begins in Zechariah 11, verses 4 to 6. The account begins with a commission to Zechariah. He is commissioned to feed the flock of slaughter, a flock that is already destined to be killed in verse 4. The possessors of the flock, they slew the flock feeling no guilt whatsoever. And the shepherds of the flock, they are supposed to protect, but they feel no pity at all when the flock are being killed. And that's verse 5. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, God will also remove his pity from the flock and from the land, and the inhabitants will now be delivered into the hand of his king. The king will smite the land, and this time God will not intervene. It is this verse that makes it clear that the flock represents the inhabitants of the land, or the people of Israel, while the careless shepherds are Israel's leaders. Now, in its New Testament fulfillment, the possessors are the Romans, and the king was the Roman emperor. In AD 70, the Romans devastated the land of Israel. In the following verses, Zechariah will explain why this was allowed to happen. He first carried out his commission in verses 7 to 11. And what did he do? He fed the flock of slaughter with a special emphasis on the poor of the flock. That's the first part of verse 7. The flock of slaughter represents all Israel, while the poor of the flock represents the remnant. And when the Messiah came, he did minister to the nation as a whole, with a special emphasis on the believing remnant, the poor of the flock. But what happened? And to carry out his commission, we see is Zechariah used two staffs. One he named beauty, which means graciousness, and the other he named bands, which means binders or union. The staff called beauty was to protect the flock, while the staff called bands was to keep the flock together. So Zechariah fulfilled his mission, saying, I fed the flock. So did Messiah in Matthew 9, verses 35 to 36. And in the course of feeding the flock, Zechariah had to cut off 3 shepherds, meaning 3 categories of Jewish leaders. Why? Because he was wary of them and they loathed him. We find it in verse 8 of Zechariah 11. Now, in the New Testament context, these would be the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sadducees. And at some point, there came a sudden ending or a sudden cessation of the feeding in verse 9. A rupture took place between the good shepherd and the flock. And the flock was now left to the natural course of events without interference from the good shepherd. Now, in its New Testament fulfillment, this event took place in Matthew 12, verses 22 to 45. And this is when the leadership of Israel rejected the messiahship of Yeshua. That's Matthew 12, 22 to 45. And now this rupture here led to the breaking of the staff named beauty in verse 10. So the protection of the flock was now removed, because remember, beauty was for protection. And the covenant that God had made with the Gentile nations that had protected Israel was now also broken. And these nations would now be permitted to devastate and scatter the flock. And the New Testament counterpart to this is Matthew 24, verses 1 to 2, along with Luke 19, verse 41 to 44, and Luke 21, 24. Matthew 24, 1 to 2, I added to your slide earlier, later tonight after I sent it off to you guys. Now, the action and meaning of the breaking of beauty were understood only by the poor of the flock in verse 11. Remember, they're the believing remnant. They gave heed to what the good shepherd had to say, for they knew that it was the word of Jehovah. The Jewish believers in Yeshua came to understand that the land and the city were destined for destruction. They abandoned Jerusalem in keeping with the Messiah's command in Luke 21, verses 20 to 24, and they fled to Pella across the other side of the Jordan. The symbolic action ends with the price of the good shepherd in Zechariah 11, verses 12 to 14. Zechariah now stood before the leadership of Israel to see what his payment would be in verse 12. Now, since no specific salary was agreed to in advance, they were to pay Zechariah whatever they thought his work was worth. Remember, he was called to be the shepherd. They valued his labors to be worthy of 30 pieces of silver in verse 12. Now, 30 pieces of silver is the price of contempt. According to Exodus 21, verse 32, if an ox gored to death a neighbor's slave, the owner of the ox was to pay the owner of the slave 30 pieces of silver, and that was considered the price of a dead slave. Later, if one wished to show contempt for another, he would pay him 30 pieces of silver, conveying that his worth was as good as that of a dead slave. That was the message that was now being conveyed to Zechariah. The New Testament fulfillment came when the leaders of Israel paid Judas Iscariot this amount as he betrayed Yeshua. Hence, Messiah was also valued at the price of a dead slave. And in this way, Israel's leaders showed that they indeed loathed him. In Matthew 26, verses 14 to 16, we read that. At this point, God gives Zechariah another commission in verse 13. The prophet is now to take the silver and dump it into the temple compound. Then God states that it was he himself who is to be sold out for 30 pieces of silver, as this was the goodly price that I was prized at by them, he says. And this prophecy was fulfilled when the Messiah was sold out for 30 pieces of silver. Again, we find it in Matthew 26, verses 14 to 16. Zechariah fulfilled this second commission in verse 13, and he cast the money into the temple compound. The New Testament fulfillment came when Judas did the very same thing with his 30 pieces of silver in Matthew 27, verses 3 to 10. This now led to the breaking of the staff named bonds. Zechariah 11, verse 14. The unity of Israel was now broken, allowing for its destruction. As history has recorded, while Jerusalem was under siege by Rome in AD 68 to AD 70, Jewish forces within the city were divided. They were fighting a civil war against each other while they were besieged by Roman soldiers. Jewish soldiers were killing other Jewish soldiers and destroying each other's food supply. And this eventually weakened the city to such a degree that the Romans were able to take it and destroy it. And so Israel became the flock of slaughter as 1,100,000 Jews were killed in AD 70. Later on, we find in Zechariah 13, verse 7, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd and against a man that is my fellow, says Jehovah of hosts. Smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered, and I will turn my hand upon the little ones." So Zechariah prophesied, or he predicted, that the rejection of the messianic shepherd would include his death, which in turn would result in the scattering of the flock of Israel. The theme of the Messiah as the Good Shepherd is now picked up by John in John's Gospel, John chapter 10, verses 1 to 18. Here, Yeshua is the Good Shepherd in verses 1 to 6. Israel's present shepherds at this time, the Pharisees, have gained rule over the flock by climbing into the sheepfold some other way, like thieves and robbers, according to verse 1 of John 10. Yeshua, on the other hand, came the right way because he came the way the Old Testament prophets predicted in verse 2. His own sheep recognized him to be the true shepherd, and they followed him in verses 3 to 6. These are the poor of the flock of Zechariah 11. The poor of the flock are always the believing remnant. Yeshua then declared himself to be the door of the sheep in verses 7 to 10. So not only is he the shepherd, but he's also the door of the sheepfold in verse 7. And those who usurped authority before him were simply thieves and robbers and not true shepherds in verse 8. The individual sheep who entered the sheepfold through Yeshua as the door found salvation and spiritual food and pasture in verse 9. The believing remnant will find this to be true. The messianic shepherd has come to provide the sheep with abundant life in verse 10. Earlier on in verses 1 to 6, Yeshua depicted himself as a good shepherd. Now he identifies himself in that role in verses 11 to 18. He is the good shepherd, and the good shepherd will willingly lay down his life for the sheep in verse 11. The hireling, the hired worker, has no love for the sheep, and he will flee in the face of danger, leaving the sheep to be destroyed in verses 12 to 13. However, Yeshua, the good shepherd, will lay down his life for his sheep in verses 14 to 15. Also, he now has other sheep that are not of this fold in verse 16. The sheep of this particular fold here, Israel, are the Jewish sheep. So, the believing sheep of this fold are the remnant of Israel. Remnant of Israel, the poor of the flock. Those Yeshua called the other sheep are Gentile believers. The good shepherd will unite the believing Jewish and Gentile sheep to become one flock under one shepherd. And this new flock is the same as the one new man of Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 to 16. This one new man is what makes it the church. It is a church. It's the body of Messiah with the Messiah as its head. Now, in order to achieve this new unity, the Messiah will have to die in verses 17 to 18. Now, some of these truths are repeated later on in John 10 in verses 26 to 30, adding the aspect there that the Messiah's sheep have eternal security. In Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46, the Gentile believers of the tribulation are also pictured as sheep. Now, the next illustration of Israel is the inheritance of God. Israel is also symbolically illustrated here as just that. The concept is first mentioned back in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 29, where the Israelites are described as God's inheritance because they are God's people. And this was a part of the reason why they were rescued from Egypt. The same relationship between the people and God's inheritance is now brought out again in Deuteronomy 32, verse 9, which states, "For Jehovah's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance." This verse is an example of Hebrew poetic parallelism. Israel is declared to be Jehovah's people, and then Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. saying the same thing two different ways. In 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 2, Saul was anointed to become the first king of Israel, making him prince over God's inheritance. Now, when Solomon dedicated his temple, he declared Israel to be God's people and inheritance, whom God had rescued out of Egypt, according to 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 51. Israel, being God's inheritance, is also a common motif in the Psalms. Psalm 28, verse 9, the psalmist implores God to save his people and to bless his inheritance. In Psalm 33:12, Israel is described as a nation whose God is Jehovah and as the people whom he has chosen for his own inheritance. Yet God was angry with his inheritance, and for that reason, he gave his people over also onto the sword in Psalm 78, verse 62. Not only Saul, but also David were chosen to be the shepherds over God's people and Israel, his inheritance. We see that in Psalm 78, verse 71. Now, although at times God will turn his inheritance over to the sword, he will never cast off his people, nor will he ever forsake his inheritance. Psalm 94, verse 14 tells us that. However, if necessary, God will pour out his wrath against his people and will abhor his inheritance. We see that in Psalm 106, verse 40. Yet ultimately, God will restore the tribes of his inheritance, which we see in Isaiah 63, verse 17. Now we come to the wife of Jehovah, and I've just done this quickly here for you to have a quick look at it. Any clear understanding of the Bible requires that we need to make proper distinctions, and we need to keep them maintained between the church and Israel. If we don't maintain this distinction, it's going to result in misinterpretation of what the scriptures teach. And in the scriptures, Israel is viewed as the wife of Jehovah, whereas the church is represented as the bride of the Messiah. Relationship with Israel as the wife to God as a husband undergoes 6 stages. We see them here. First, we're going to have the marriage contract and the great adultery, the separation, the divorce, the punishment, and then the remarriage with restored blessings. We're going to look at each of those. We'll look at I think it's the first 3 or 4. Stage 1, we see the marriage contract. Now, to someone who's just a casual or a superficial reader, the book of Deuteronomy just simply seems to be a repetition of what Moses had written earlier in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. The title of Deuteronomy actually means second law or repetition of the law. Almost everything in the book of Deuteronomy can also be found in the 3 preceding books of the law of Moses. However, Deuteronomy is not just a book of repetitions. The entire format of the text is that of both an ancient treaty and also an ancient marriage contract. Moses, he took various facets of the 3 earlier books, and he now presented them in the form of an ancient marriage contract signed by Israel and God. Through this contract, Israel became the wife of Jehovah. And we're going to concentrate on a few key passages of Deuteronomy just to show how it fits into the scheme of a marriage contract. The first passage is Deuteronomy 5, verses 1 to 3. Verses 2 and 3 says this: Jehovah our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Jehovah made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. So here it declares that God entered into a covenant with his people Israel at Mount Sinai. It's going to be seen later on that the Jewish prophets also viewed this covenant relationship as a marriage contract. Later on in Deuteronomy 6, verses 10 to 15, God announced his jealousy over his wife Israel. And in this passage, Israel is warned against adultery. Now, since Jehovah is Israel's husband, the means by which Israel can be guilty of adultery is by worshiping other gods, idols, false gods. God warned Israel not to become an adulterous wife by playing around with other gods. And the reason given is God's burning jealousy, lest it be kindled against her and eventually cause her expulsion out of the land that God has given her. Now, moving on in Deuteronomy 7, verses 6 to 11, Israel is again described as the one chosen by God. In verse 6, God described the choosing. In verses 7 and 8, he gave the reason. Now, he did not choose Israel as his wife due to her size, because Israel was only small. He had only one basic reason, and that was his love for her. Because of his love for Israel, he entered into a covenant relationship with her. And this covenant relationship is the marriage contract of Deuteronomy. Now Israel has an obligation in verses 9 to 11 of Deuteronomy 7. God now implored Israel to be a faithful wife to Jehovah by being obedient and in subjection to him. Now, as we saw earlier, the prophet, or as we spoke a bit earlier, the prophets looked at this covenant relationship as a marriage contract. And one example we find in Ezekiel 16, verse 8. Ezekiel 16:8 says this, "Now when I passed by you and looked upon you, behold, your time was a time of love. And I spread my skirt over you and covered your nakedness. Yes, I swore unto you and entered into a covenant with you, says the Lord Jehovah, and you became mine." In this verse, Ezekiel described the covenant at Sinai and the relationship between Israel and Jehovah in terms of the wedding night. So in the first stage of her relationship as the wife of Jehovah, Israel entered into a marriage contract, and this marriage contract is the book of Deuteronomy. Stage 2, we see the great adultery. Although Israel was sternly admonished to remain faithful to her husband, she became guilty of great adultery, described by several Old Testament passages. Jeremiah 3, verses 1 to 5, states that Israel was not merely guilty of a one-time adultery, but she was guilty of playing the harlot with many lovers. And because of this, later on in verse 20 of chapter 3, Jeremiah wrote that Israel was indeed like a wife who was turned away from her husband. She was a wife guilty of adultery. Now, because of this adultery, the original marriage contract was now broken, according to Jeremiah 31, verse 32. "Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband unto them, says Jehovah." Adultery meant that the marriage contract became null and void. Jeremiah showed the problem was not with the husband, for God was a good husband. Rather, the problem was with the wife who insisted in going after other gods and so became guilty of the great adultery. Ezekiel also described this great adultery in an extended passage in Ezekiel 16, verses 15 to 34. The prophet Ezekiel declared Israel's guilt by showing that she had indeed played the part of a prostitute in verse 15. Although prostitutes generally receive money for their services, Israel was different because she paid her lovers in verses 16 to 19. And she paid them with the very things that her true husband, God, had given to her as his wife. Furthermore, Israel's very children were sacrificed to these lovers, the pagan gods, in verses 20 to 21 of Ezekiel 16. Israel indeed forgot the love of her youth when God first entered into the covenant relationship with her back in verse 22. In verses 23 to 29, the prophet now goes on to portray the lovers that Israel went after. These lovers were the gods of the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. The absurdity of Israel's adultery is clearly spelled out here. The very nations that these foreign gods represented did the most to hurt Israel. Israel suffered terribly from the hands of the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. Yet, rather than turning to her own husband, Jehovah, Israel went after the very gods of these nations and committed adultery with them. Israel's weak heart caused her to commit adultery to the point of bribing her lovers in verses 30 to 34. Hosea also had described this adultery in Hosea chapter 2, verses 2 to 5. The prophet declared the charge God had against Israel. She was guilty of harlotry. Not only did she commit adultery, but she produced children of adultery who were therefore illegitimate, according to verse 4. She played the part of a prostitute, verse 5. And to summarize the second stage of Israel's relationship to God as a wife to her husband, it can be said that despite God's manifold blessings to Israel, Israel turned away from God in order to play the part of a prostitute. And so she became guilty of the great adultery. Then after that, we now have the stage 3, which is a separation. Because of this adultery, a separation took place between God and Israel. The separation took place in the days of Isaiah and is described in Isaiah 50, verse 1. Thus says Jehovah, where is the bill of your mother's divorcement wherewith I have put her away? Or which of my creditors is it to whom I have sold you? Behold, for your iniquities were you sold, and for your transgressions was your mother put away. Now, going back to Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, if a husband wished to divorce his wife, he had to write out a bill of divorcement. After having written it out in longhand, he would then give it to his wife, and then the divorce was final. What are we seeing here? By the time Isaiah became a prophet, Israel's adultery was so great that it was necessary for God to withhold his many blessings from her. The blessings described in Deuteronomy to be received if Israel remained faithful. This removal of the material provisions caused many in Israel to say that God had divorced his wife. Therefore, God spoke to Isaiah the prophet, stating that he had not yet divorced his wife. If God had divorced his wife, he would have given Israel a bill of divorcement. And since no such bill of divorcement was in hand, it meant that a divorce had not yet taken place in Isaiah. Rather than a divorce, a separation had taken place. But this separation was caused by Israel's adultery. And so, in the days of Isaiah, God and Israel were not divorced, but they were separated. And this separation was due to Israel's adultery and lasted approximately 100 years. And we will see that in the next session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.